Okay, we're picking up right where we left off. Let me get more of the screen in. So I'm just picking up from the end of the notes that I had when I turned it off. Still on the list of things that living things have. Living things, in order to do stuff, in order to do anything, anytime, you need energy. They are energetic systems. They use energy, they change energy, they transform energy from one form to another. Sometimes a complex change, and sometimes a fairly simple shift of one type of chemical energy to another type of chemical energy. The term that goes with this is metabolism. I know that's a weird B. What you find in a lot of biological terminology is, excuse me, parameters. Metabolism is one of those terms that has parameters. The metabolism is, when you're talking about metabolism, you're talking about energy movement. And you can look at metabolism in a very, very specific way. A lot of times what's being looked at biologically are in pathways. The energy comes in this molecule, and then there's a chemical change, now it's over here, and there's a chemical change, now it's over here. There's a chemical change, and this comes in and becomes part of it. And that is a pathway, step by step by step processes. Your body's full of them, your cells are full of them. But we could look at the metabolism of a cell. We could look at the metabolism of an organ. We could look at the metabolism of a system. We could look at the metabolism of an individual. We could look at the metabolism of a population of individuals. We could look at the metabolism of a community or an ecosystem, in which case we'd be including external energy as well. So metabolism is one of those things where you kind of know what you're looking for, and then you define where you're looking for it. And there's a lot of terms that work that way, especially ecological terms. Another term I want to kind of toss in here, it isn't directly connected to metabolism, but it gives me a chance to talk about it. This is a way of figuring out the world. And it's a very, very, very common way to approach understanding things. And when you're trying to figure out metabolism, it's a good example. But that's what I'm talking about here. This applies very, very broadly in not just science, but in the world. Reductionism. The idea of reductionism is, okay, I'm looking at a complicated system. I want to understand how the complicated system works. What's my approach? Let me figure out what all the bits and pieces do. If I know what all the bits and pieces do, then I understand the system. I understand the complexity of the system. And that sounds reasonable, right? Is that in an old car, that would work really well. In a Victorian era machine, that would work really well. What you wind up with, unfortunately, as systems get more and more and more complex, is a feature called emergent properties, where the system gets so complicated that it does things that don't seem to be reducible. They don't seem to be, you don't seem to be able to break them down to component bits to make sense of them. Now, of course, people go, we need to understand the bits better. Is that there's no such thing as, because emergent properties almost sounds like this magical thing, where you get interactions that just kind of come out of no logical connection. And there's a lot of people who absolutely look at things. Human consciousness is an emergent property. And people go, well, if we just understood how the brain worked better, we understood what was going on interacting the cells and what's happening in each cell, we could figure out why we have this kind of expanded idea of ourselves and the world that we think doesn't happen in animals. Not that easy to measure. But even something of, now my wife works in IT. I am famous for being near electronic devices, and I know this makes no sense. So just take, I know it doesn't make any sense. I just see it happen all the time. Because I cannot tell you how many times I have been near some electronic device, either my own or someone else's, and had somebody who understood these devices look at it and go, I've never seen it do that before. I didn't know it could do that. I don't know why it's doing that. Is that my wife many times is that I go, my computer's doing this, and she goes, no, you can't do that. And then she goes, looks at it, and as my definition of a computer person is someone who sits in front of a screen and says, but it's not supposed to do that. Emergent properties, even modern computers are in your cell phone. I can't tell you how many times I've screwed up people's cell phones just by being near them. I know it makes no sense. But, you know, remember somebody with one of those little swipe things. I was buying something at a fencing nationals, and he'd swipe the thing. He'd been doing it all day, you know, taking cards from people. And he says to his buddy, what am I supposed to do now? His buddy comes over and looks at it and goes, I don't know. I've never seen it do that before. Try again. Well, yeah, it's still doing it. And, you know, it's just, it's weird. It's an emergent property that my ability to influence makes zero sense in the reductionist world. And I will acknowledge that I can't break down why it repeatedly happens. You know, people just don't put out fields that should have that kind of effect. But, you know, there's more things on heaven and earth that are dreamt of in our philosophies. Little Shakespeare addition to your biology. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. Life on Earth, what we find, is compartmentalized. Is that we're dynamic systems, but we're a bunch of little bitty dynamic systems working together if we are multicellular. If we are even in a cell, there's a whole bunch of little bits and pieces that are working together. A cell is basically an isolation system. It's a bunch of chemicals surrounded by a membrane that doesn't allow that much to go in and out. So you can do stuff in the cell that isn't happening around you, isn't happening to the cell next door. And so it allows this level of energetic use and complexity that we talked about on the very first level. So this probably should have been back there. It is in my other class. As I said, there's a bunch of different ways to organize this list. Inside cells are little specialized bits that have their own little specialized functions. And at some point, I always wonder how these things come about, where somebody, you know, sees this and goes, well, you need a name for it because we need to name stuff. Second semester, I'll tell you, there's a feature that, so far as I can tell, is there, and everybody who works with it knows it's there, and so far as I can tell, nobody's given it a name, or at least nobody's agreed on a name. I haven't seen anybody suggest a name. That's really weird. Think about that. Anyway, they went, it works kind of like an organ in a body. What do we call it? Well, they decided to call it organelles, and it does kind of work like an organ in a body, except it's in a single cell. And so that's a level of dynamism that again is compartmentalization within compartmentalization within compartmentalization. Vast majority of living things on the planet are unicellular, are single-celled. Classically, is if you could put all of the single-celled organisms, which would be a huge fraction of that would be bacteria, on one side of a balance, and all of the not single-celled organisms on the other side of the balance, The single-celled ones would outweigh them. Not only would there be a hell of a lot more of them, but they would actually have more mass. We are a world of unicellular organisms, is we just happen to be more noticeable. I tend to use the word single-celled more. It's simpler as I try to reduce the amount of terminology as I'm kind of zipping through the things that I say very quickly. Try to keep them simpler so that your brain isn't, what the hell does that mean? Going. It's a science. In a lot of ways, it's basically the equivalent of learning a foreign language. And how complicated or uncomplicated I make that, yeah, trying to reduce it. And of course, there's stuff like us, multicellular or multi-celled, which doesn't really simplify it much. Now, if you're like a lot of people, you have a tendency to see the world in yins and yangs and kind of what they call a dichotomous. Either or. Things are either this or they're that. Now, this looks like a pretty classic either or choice. Turns out it's not. There's actually a third choice here that's between them. There is a type of approach to life that you see in a bunch of species where if you're looking at the species under natural conditions, there's a whole bunch of them, but you always find them in groups, and it isn't like a simple group where they're just hanging out together like a herd. It's a group, a complex group, where different members of the group are doing different things in support of the group. That is a colonial species. We're a colonial species. So it isn't just single-celled that can do this. There's a lot of multi-celled organisms do this. Some plants do this, and a lot of animals do this. But if you're single-celled, and you're getting a bunch of cells together, and each one is taking a different assignment in support of the group, then you're behaving like you're a multi-celled. What makes it different is if something comes along and pulls the group apart, you can live on your own, right? Same thing with us. We are colonial. We work much better as a group where we're sharing and splitting the jobs up. But you know, you take us and drop us on an island by ourselves, we're probably gonna die. But we could live, is that we could do all the jobs necessary to keep ourselves alive if we absolutely had to. It's just not a good approach for us. And the same thing happens with single-celled colonials, where you virtually never find them as individual cells. You always find them in groups with the jobs split up. Just to give you a local example, in the summertime, if you've got a pond and it's going kind of a Kelly green, kind of a yellowish green, if you dip a nice big glass in there and hold it up to the light, it's a very good chance you'll be able to see by eye little floating balls, little floating green balls. Under a microscope, they are hollow spheres, and the outside of the sphere is all dots. Each one of those dots is an individual cell. They're all stuck to one another. And they're not all doing the same thing. Some of them are using their little flagellar tail to help move the ball around. They're not feeding. There are other members that are pulling food particles out of the water, breaking them down and sharing the nutrition with the guys that are not feeding. Some of them are reproducing. There you go, well, that seems crazy, because if I'm just doing the feeding and they're doing the reproducing, then how's that good for me? Well, asexual organisms. Everybody in the ball basically has the same genetics, but so they're reproducing for me, they're basically reproducing me if it's all asexual. But it's a single-celled colonial organism, and there turn out to be a decent number of those, where they're kind of in this gray area between unicellular and multicellular. Just to talk about other levels of collection. Here's another one of those sets of parameter terms. What's a population? Well, in humans, it's a group of people that have some commonality. Could be the population of a city. They all live in the city. It could be a population of Italian Americans. They all have ancestors that came from Italy. It could be a population of moviegoers. They're all going to the movies. But something links them together. Biologically, a population is a group of the same species. So a whole bunch of individuals, all the same species. Now parameters are, you could look at the population in a limited frame. Like say I wanted to look at wolf spiders. I could try to do the population of wolf spiders that exist in this building. I could do the population of wolf spiders that exists on the campus. I could do the county, I could do the state. Is that I'm still only looking at groups of wolf spiders, but I'm defining where the edges of the population are. When you go to community, now you bring in different species that are important. So if I'm doing a study of wolf spiders, I probably want to also look at potential prey animals and predators of wolf spiders. Wolf spiders are very integrated with building their funnel webs in plants, that's where they reproduce. So I would be looking at the plants that they're likely to reproduce on, and maybe the plants that affect those plants. So, and again, I could limit it to an area. But you also wind up limiting it to what you think are the important species, because you can't look at every single species in a system. It's just, number one, you don't know them all. And number two, they're not all important. And an ecosystem is the same idea, but now you're looking at the parts of the system that are not alive, right? If I'm doing the campus, the climate, the rain, the temperature, the weather, the soil composition, there's a whole bunch of things that might very well be important that affect the community, that affect the population that I'm interested in. And so these are other levels of dynamic complexity that we have to take into account. And as I said, these are mostly ecological terms. Okay, I'm gonna stop this one before we go on to the next one.